So, hello everyone, I'm Raj Chengadu, and welcome to my sit down today with Rob King from King Property. Rob is an experienced developer in the south of England, and he specialises primarily in commercial conversions. We're going to find out a little bit more about Rob's strategy as we go along. But before we get into that, Rob, welcome. Thanks for joining me today.
Hi Raj, thank you very much. A pleasure to be here, really excited.
Yeah, no, I've been looking forward to getting you on, looking forward to diving into your particular property strategy. But before we get into that, Rob, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? How did you get into property and why did you choose property to get into?
I was thinking about this before this conversation. I've always loved property, always known from playing Monopoly as a 9-year-old with my uncle for hours and hours on end. I've always loved it. I remember I'd be moving house with my parents, and I'm going to show my age now. In the olden days, when you had a piece of paper with a printout of the houses that you could buy, and in the corner was a staple attached to a tiny little photograph, and I would collect the ones up that my parents didn't like, and I just loved it. I don't know why. I loved it from day one, and started investing. Well, I bought my first home 1 month before I entered the world of work. So I didn't even have a salary. Those were the days. I had no salary. I just was waving a contract that was due to start in November, and in October I completed the purchase of my first home, and loved it ever since, to be honest.
So was it always on the cards for you? I know, like you said, playing Monopoly, it's a great game. Like you said, as kids, it gets almost imprinted in our brains that property is a great way to go. Was there any kind of breaking point for you that you said, no matter what, I know I'm going to get into this?
Yeah, I think that planted the seed, and then life gets in the way. You go to uni, you pursue dreams that in my case weren't necessarily the right sorts of dreams. Went up to London chasing the money, jobs, etc. And it took me a while to come back to it, and there wasn't the education, there weren't the meetings around in those days, or I certainly didn't know about them if any of them were there. And it took me a while. It took me a while to realise that there was a better way than like working hard, living hard, paying lots of expensive mortgages, and going out for fancy dinners and spending all your money. I sort of knew there was something better than that, but it took me a while to realise that I could come back to actually playing Monopoly, and moving flats in London made me think, God, I could actually hold on to my existing property, move into my new one, and just about make it all work if I just get one of these weird things called a buy-to-let mortgage, which hadn't been around, in my eyes, hadn't been around very long at all. I literally thought it was voodoo magic that I could go to the bank and get another loan. I mean, actually, people have been, buy-to-let mortgages have been around probably five years or so at that point. And actually, crazy Mortgage Express things were happening, but I didn't know about any of that. I was just so happy I didn't have to sell up to move, and then was like, wow, I'm definitely becoming a landlord, no question. Of course, someone else is going to pay my mortgage, pay all the running costs, and give me some extra. I mean, I loved it instantly, and I was kind of hooked from then, but stuck in a really busy job, and you work too hard, head down, doing other things, and it took me a long while to slowly build the portfolio from there, and start to save up more deposit money. I went to Japan to work for a year, as we got to the height of the sort of craziness in the early 2000s, well, early to mid 2000s, I guess, sort of 2006 or 5 and 6. Made a massive mistake. I was desperate to buy another property. I didn't really have very many, but I hadn't done anything for a year or two. Desperate to buy another one. I was in Japan, working really hard, tired and bored, and bought something in England, sight unseen, off a saucer. I paid 51,000. He promised me that it would be worth 65. If I'd have known about Mortgage Express, I suppose I'd probably stopped by then, to be honest. But classic kind of instant equity type idea. and that was a pretty sharp lesson, to be honest. That was a pretty massive failure for me in the end. But I had the bug. I was determined. And then when I finally came back to the country, I was off to the races and, reading books, investing, saving money. I read Rich Dad Poor Dad 10 times over. After that Japan year, we went traveling, and I didn't have a computer with me, but I would do cash flow forecast spreadsheets on a piece of paper, because I was determined I was going to make this work, and I couldn't jump away from the day job straight away, because these things take a bit of time. But I was absolutely determined to do it.
The plan was in motion by that point.
Yeah, I'm not even sure there was a proper plan. It was hastily scribbled notes on the couple pieces of paper that I had as we were in some hostel halfway around the world somewhere. But I knew for sure it was going to happen, and I wasn't very quick at making it happen once we came back. But I had a couple false starts as well once we came back. But it was definitely on the cards by then.
Well, that's it. It's not always linear, is it? Following your dreams at the end of the day.
I don't think it's ever linear, is it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, people think that, oh, don't worry, I'll buy one property, I'll buy the next one, and I'll just keep making profit with no mistakes. But like you said, it goes up, down, left, right. You've got to make a few mistakes sometimes,
That's exactly what my plan said. I would buy one every 6 months. I'd recycle the money. I'd have the deposit for the next one. That next one would magically turn up at the right point in the cycle. Rinse and repeat. It looked wonderful, and I'd get really frustrated once I was back that I couldn't find things to buy, and then suddenly a bunch would come along at once, a bit like buses. You wait for ages, and then 2 or 3 come along at once. And I made quite a lot of mistakes as I was buying then, but most of them were good, and I learned pretty quickly. I realised pretty fast that you don't buy lots and lots of properties all at once. They're big, they're expensive. You wait carefully, buy them one at a time carefully. So you haven't got the luxury of getting it wrong too many times. So it's fine, make a mistake, but you better learn from it. And I really wanted to go again pretty quickly afterwards. Having learnt the lessons. I bought some 1-bed flats I shouldn't have bought. I bought some things, like short leases or flats that were never going to fit my model. I tried lots of different variations on the theme, and it took me a while before I knew what was right. And in the end, I wanted to accelerate that, and I started tentatively looking at small blocks of flats. So rather than buying a 2-bedroom flat that I would buy for 90 to 100,000 pounds at the time, do a 10,000 pound refurb on, and revalue at 130. Lovely, straightforward model, really hard to find, but really good, lucrative long term hold. Rather than do that, I came across a few blocks of flats. And you could kind of do the same thing, but do it on 4 properties at once or 5 at once. And the prices weren't crazy because the individual price of each unit wasn't very high. They were very much sort of bog standard rental stock. So it was kind of in my comfort zone. But because it was 4 units at once, then that was a brand new thing, and that was at the time quite a stretch. But it was brilliant because it accelerates your journey. If I was on a track for 1 every 6 months, then buy 4, and that's 2 years worth of progress.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's a great point actually. That the time it takes and the effort it takes to do one project, sometimes 2 or 3 flats within the same block, it's not 2 or 3 times the effort.
Yeah, absolutely not. It's one lot of effort to find the building or the flat or the site, and then it's essentially no extra effort. You get the other 3 or 4 as a bonus. Someone's got to do the work in them, of course. The refurb, you can't get away from that. The first block that was I sort of did 2 at once, but the first one that really taught me how to do the model properly was 5 small 1-bedroom flats. And I reckon that took no more effort to manage. I owned it for about 3 years all in. no more effort to manage than about 2 separate flats on its own, and yet I got the benefit of 5 rents because I owned the building, I owned the fabric of the building, I owned the freehold, I owned the communal areas. I just had to worry about getting the communal cleaner in, and if there was a leak in one flat to the flat below, well, I owned them all, and one maintenance team could sort everything out. It just worked really well, but it's 5x the return.
And like you said, even with 5x the return, those extra things you have to do, like you said, if there's a leak in one, you can get help because there's margin within that. There's enough margin within a bigger project, and not too big a project that's so far out of your comfort zone that you're overwhelmed, but just gradual steps makes perfect sense what you've done there.
It was that was brilliant. And I said to myself, for the first year, I had to buy it at a bit of a risk, and so I pumped a bit of money in at the beginning. And I said to myself, at the first year, I'm only going to recycle any money that I make back into the building. There were loads of sort of little bits of maintenance work or small improvements, communal paint job or painting a particular unit or upgrading the garden. Just lots of small jobs. And each month it netted around £1,000, sort of £850 to £1,000. And then that was another £1,000 of work I could plow back into it. And then the following month it was a little bit better and a little bit better. And then when a tenant moved out, suddenly, it was 6 months down the line and we'd done £6,000 worth of upgrades, and it was that bit better. And then there was a bit more rent, and it just worked really well. Of course, I wasn't taking any of the money at that point, because I still had a day job, so I wasn't needing any of that cash flow. Well, it fed itself. After my initial deposit, it fed itself. And let me just think about the numbers a little bit. The purchase price of that building was £250,000, and it was 5 one-bedroom flats. And it's just, that's in a sort of central area in Southampton. It's just crazy. It was a few years ago, so I'm going to get this a little bit wrong, but I reckon it was 2015, 2014, something like that.
Not that long ago then.
Well, actually, not that. I mean, it's as crazy now to think about buying a flat for 50,000 as it was then. And there were these, the smallest of these was 24 square metres. How the previous owner ever got permission to create them, I don't know, but they were fully consented. They just really opened my eyes, that project. It was on the open market. It had been on the open market for ages. It went to auction, and I had the inside track on it because my managing agent, I was very friendly with the person in the agency that did the managing agent work, like the employee, if you like. And her company managed that block. And so she gave me every snippet of information I could possibly want about that block while I was looking at it. And I found out later that there was really only one other serious bidder. I was on the phone. There's one other serious bidder at the auction against me, and it was actually her boss, the boss of her agency, wanted this building for himself, but he didn't know as much about the building as she did because he hadn't bothered to look, and she told me everything. So I actually knew more than the boss did, even though it was his company that managed the building. It was just crazy. Total insanity.
So it was an existing residential building, that one was?
That one was an it was an old sort of large 3-bedroom house that had already been converted to 5 flats, but actually the conversion hadn't been finished. It didn't have building control sign-off, which is why it had eventually gone to auction, because it was a slightly tricky purchase. I naively bid at auction, got scared as we were being bid up. As it got to sort of 239, 240, 241, I blurted out 250, and then there was silence from everyone in the room, and I was like, oh no, I've made a mistake, this is ridiculous, what have I done? And then absolutely panicked, and then bought it at 250. Of course, in those days, that was the stamp duty, that was a stamp duty leap at that point.
Yes, yeah.
And I thought I'd just blown £8,000 or £9,000, but actually the boldness knocked the boss of the agency out. And a week later, he and I got on the phone. I mean, we knew each other anyway because they managed a bunch of my properties. And then he admitted that he was my counter bidder, and he berated me for bidding on that, for that, and overbidding, and how crazy stupid I was. I'd overpaid. Who on earth would want to pay any more than 240, let alone paying 250 for that building? He thought it was worth 235 and not a penny more. Well, in my spreadsheet, it said 271.
That's it. Not everyone is singing from the same hymn sheet at the end of the day. You know, you could have seen things that they didn't, and vice versa. You know,
yeah,
that's the way it goes.
I think he had all the opportunity to see all the detail, because he could have just looked in his own files at his company, but I had done that, and I knew what there was to know about the building.
So that's funny, actually, that even though you said your spreadsheet said that the top value that you could pay for it was 271, but your emotions when you're in that room or when you're there actually doing it, you know, I completely see that you get nervous, you get scared at 250, and you start doubting yourself, even though the figures, you've done the figures, it will make sense. But yeah,
totally, yeah. I mean, it's that herd mentality, isn't it? I was at 235. I was confident. At 240, at 241. It was fine. I was £30,000 off my limit. It didn't matter, and I just felt that somewhere the other bidder was maybe wavering or not. I don't know. And I just jumped up, thinking maybe I can get it. Thinking in my head, this would be a steal. I'm saving £20,000, and then the moment the hammer went down, just petrified that I'd overpaid, and you just get that empty feeling inside you that I've just wasted the price of a car. You know, just craziness. And that was the best decision I ever made, to jump up from counter bidding to get to the point where I just, you know, blocked everyone else out. That building was brilliant.
That's a good lesson there, escaping the herd mentality, just blocking everyone else out, and kind of going over your figures in your head that no, you are doing the right thing. It's easier said than done. Don't get me wrong. When you've got to be placed in that situation, it's got to be very different. But,
it's scary and exhilarating at the same time. And I still love the auctions now. I mean, I've only made a few sort of purchase or sales there through my time. You know, bid on loads and lost, as we all do, I think, if we go to auction. But it's great fun. It's like free entertainment. I think it's like a day out. If you've got something to bid on, and you know you go and register and you're raising your hand, it's really exciting. But that day it was a bit too exciting. But that project, I mean, God, I bid, and of course it was 28 days. It was an auction contract. I didn't have my finance lined up. I mean, what was I thinking? You know, it's just craziness. And I ended up, I didn't get a bridge. I got a conventional, like, sort of semi-commercial loan with Shawbrook, who, you know, like, are not in any way, shape or form nice or fast or easy to work with. I mean, now they have like a sort of bridging style product. Then they didn't. It was basically just a commercial type buy to let style commercial loan, basically. God, did I hound that mortgage packager? Wow, I feel sorry for. In retrospect, I'm embarrassed by how, like, there was 10 minutes didn't go by where we weren't in contact. I didn't sleep for 4 weeks, and in the end, they served notice to complete on me. So at the end of the 4 weeks, I had 10 working days to complete, and I completed on the 11th, 1 day late. So we start to finish 6 weeks and a day it took. And I remember going to I've been going to the same mastermind in London for years, and at the next meeting I went up there and I told the story of how hard it was to get the finance through, and they just like stopped me and looked at me really quizzical, like, Rob, you managed to get a loan start to finish in less than 6 weeks. That's phenomenal. And there was me thinking it was really bad.
I mean, it's amazing what you can achieve when you have to.
Yeah, well, I had my full deposit funds, so in the end I put £72,500 into that deal, and I had that, but I was bidding 250. I should have had 250 to buy the building, and every day for those 6 weeks, I just thought, I've put £25,000 down. If this doesn't work, I've lost £25,000. What am I going to do? And yeah, when there's a fire under you, it's incredible. It's incredible what you can get done.
Also, do you think sometimes that if you knew the road ahead, if you knew what you had to do, you probably never would have got started. You'd probably never have been in the room.
I was just thinking that. And yeah, not having the money, it being an auction purchase, 28-day contract. And I glossed over this earlier. It didn't have building control sign off. So
Wow.
I couldn't get the lending until it got building control sign off. So in those 6 weeks, I had to get builders in and they had to finish off the works. Now, there were a bunch of minor works, but actually building control weren't even very clear on what needed to be done. So the first step was to try and get the officer round to give me a list of the things that he felt needed doing. Then I needed to get a team in to do the work, and I needed to get him back to sign it off and produce the certificate before the lender would part with the money. I got it down to only sort of £6,000 or £8,000 worth of work, and most of it was quite minor. But the list was reasonably long, and again, I'd committed to paying £250,000 for something, and it wasn't even mortgageable at all. So I look back and it was just a bit silly.
It's a lot of lessons, though. That is unbelievable what you could achieve when you add that on and not having sign off as well. That's 6 weeks. That'll give you some grey hairs, I'm sure.
It was just really silly, and I think I did that. Yeah, I did. I had a day job still while that was happening, so it was just it was quite a lesson. But that block, it made after I only had £72,000 in it. Maybe 80 by the time of the cost of the works. It made me £1,000 a month for 3 years. And then I sold it for £410,000. And I didn't spend another penny on it after that initial... Well, the £8,000 plus its own money, it was feeding itself. I didn't invest any more of my money in it.
No, so that's an incredible return after all
brilliant.
that, like you said, for all that effort, obviously, in such a short amount of time. The returns are on that project. It was still the right thing to do. Like you said, knowing what you know now, you just plan a bit differently. But how do you know that until you honestly learn and educate yourself? And sometimes that happens just through experience, doesn't it?
Yeah, you just have to push yourself. Yeah, have to push yourself forward and do it. And that launched me. But I think I sold I think I said 15, 16. I think I sold it in 2015 or 16. So I must have bought it maybe 2012, 2013. So not massively far out of the sort of recession that really, that did for Northern Rock and sort of hit in 2009. And we were still in the doldrums in 10 and 11. We were just coming out of that, but not massively. I think I might have bought it in 2012 or 13. And so I learned that lesson then. And by 2016, I'd done enough that I'd gone full time. And that was, so I suppose that was quite a learning, and that was the trigger really from in those sort of 3 or 4 years whilst I was owning that property and finding others and doing others. And very quickly I did another block of flats, which was less successful because it was a single leasehold that contained 4 flats. And It was above commercial. So it wasn't 4 leasehold flats. It was 1 leasehold of 150 years that had 4 flats on it. So it was quite complicated, and it was above commercial, and that was less successful. So I was learning on the ones that made money, and I was also learning on the ones that didn't do quite so well.
That's the way it goes sometimes, isn't it? Absolutely. You don't know what you're going to come up against sometimes until you're in the project. So
Totally. And that, between those two, that was 5 in one and 4 in another. And so that year I'd added 9 to the portfolio, and that was sort of quite a significant change at that point, and was really, compared to my spreadsheet of where I wanted to be, that was really opening my eyes to what was possible. And I'd not been bold enough in the spreadsheet ever to suggest that I could grow that quick. And it really, really got me thinking, well, I could see in a few years' time, I could step away from the day job. And at that point, I just lost love with my work, really.
Rob, I want to move on slightly to talk about commercial conversions, because I know that's one of your current strategies that you look at. For people who don't know, can you tell us what a commercial conversion is? I know it pretty much says what it is on the tin, but it'd be good to hear exactly what it is for people who don't know.
So for me, what we do is primarily office to residential commercial conversions. So I won't get too technical for too long, but an office has a use class that's B1A. That's just the letter that the government gives it. And in 2013, they brought in something called prior approval, which is like a streamlined planning process that means that if you want to turn an office into residential dwellings, it actually allows it to fit into permitted development. So what that means is you just have to meet some simple, straightforward criteria. And so for office to residential, there's only 4 that you need to meet. And as long as your office building meets those criteria, you can apply for this prior approval, and then you have permission to turn it into residential way, way easier than you would if you had a full planning application. You don't have to meet national space standards. They decide in 56 days. If they're not sure, the balance of power sits with you, and you sort of almost automatically get permission. It's far more in the favour of the developer. So I jumped onto that strategy. The government made those changes in 2013. I jumped onto that strategy, sort of 2015, I suppose. Watching it in 2014, jumped onto it in 2015, and then by 2016. Had enough 2 deals going on that were office to residential conversions, both around 2,000 square feet offices into 4 units each, and a healthy pipeline of future projects that made me feel confident enough that I could jump out of my day job and focus on property full time, which had been my aim for years by then.
Before we go forward and maybe look at an example of a office conversion, you said there was 4 criteria that they tend to look for permitted development. I don't know if you can quickly touch on those, if you can reel them off at the top of your head, if you know.
Yeah, okay. So the 4 are, it has to meet, one of the hardest ones is highways. And strictly speaking, there's no planning requirement here, but actually it does have to meet highways. So they're thinking about sort of access, egress, access for fire, access for ambulance, that sort of thing. Flooding, is it in a flood zone 3? That's very easy. That's very easy to find out. I can't believe I'm blanking on the other 2. Sorry, you put me on the spot. That's ridiculous.
No, sorry. It's just
noise.
You mentioned it. I thought
noise.
I
Excuse me. Flooding, highways, noise was the 3rd one added in, which was added in later. Gosh, that's ridiculous. I can't remember the last one.
It wasn't the square footage that you had to meet the criteria for the square meter.
No, because there isn't one for office. There are for a bunch of the other use classes, but not for office to resi. That was one of the earlier ones, and I think in hindsight, the government probably feel they made a mistake with that, because on the others, they like retail to residential. They put 150 square meter unit on it because they only wanted smaller retail, and some of the others they were 500 square meter. But office to resi, you can do it any size, which is why you see people, taking over sort of large call centre buildings that are 20,000 square feet and turning them into lots and lots of units. That's a step braver than I go. I like to do the smaller ones.
But the greatest thing about that permitted development and that change of use is, like you said, this completely speeds up the process. You're not waiting in planning for however long, depending on how that process takes. Because you can effectively buy unconditionally. Because if you know what the rules are and the regulations are, you could buy and move quite fast with that project.
And I've done quite a lot of purchasing unconditionally, and again that was, I think, another of those things where I feel now that I was quite brave about doing that. But you do become very confident and you know those criteria very well, and make sure you seek out buildings that fit those criteria properly. I always make sure I check with the planning consultant just to make sure there's nothing nasty in it. But it's a far more streamlined process, which allows you to be that much more confident, and of course then you can maybe bid a bit higher or just be a bit bolder with how you act. and you know you're going to get a decision in 56 days. I mean, since it came out, the goalposts have moved a little bit. It's become less in the favour of the developer, but certainly when I started doing them, by the 57th day, if you didn't have a decision, you had an implicit yes. You could go ahead with whatever you wanted, and they'd lost the opportunity to apply any conditions at all. So it was sort of deemed approval, which can cause its own trouble because your lender's not necessarily going to like that. They like to see a piece of paper. But it's brilliant in terms of giving you the opportunity to be confident about bidding. And we would bid unconditionally, time and time again, and won a number of them for that reason. Contamination is the one I've forgotten.
Okay.
And I should know better than that, because my first site in Winchester, we actually did have to prove that there was no contamination because it was on the site of an old printworks. And it was the storage room for the old printworks, so they were worried that there was VOCs, volatile organic compounds. So whatever, some solvent from a printing process, 100 years ago. And they were worried they were in the ground. So I really should remember that one. So transport and highways, noise, contamination and flooding, to attempt to redeem myself for not knowing.
No. That's perfect. That's great for people who are considering it. It's important for them to know the certain areas that they have to address beforehand, certain surveys they might have to get and look into.
So I'll just go over each quickly then. So flooding, Google is your best friend. It's very, very easy to get a map that shows you what flood zone you're in. You want to be in 1. You don't want to be in. You can't be in 3. And there are some things you can do to mitigate if you're in 2. I mean, I'm being a bit blasé about that. Obviously, there's in lots of circumstances there's always something you can do, but generally speaking, it's going to be very, very hard to get anything if you're in 3. And in 2, you need to be careful. What flood zone 1, you're fine. Contamination, there's lots of sort of surveys and maps that will tell you what's going on there. And even if you have to do some investigation, there's lots of investigations you can do. Sending soil samples off to labs and doing air pollution tests and contamination tests and all sorts of things that you can do there. But generally speaking, a bit of time at the desk working it out, you can do quite well there. Transport on highways used to be a little bit easier, but more and more they'd like to see some parking, but they can't require any parking. So frequently we do it without any parking. In fact, we often now redline our applications just exactly around the building and include no outside space whatsoever. That's only for the planning application. For the development, we are going to include plenty outside space and as much parking as we can, but we don't want the prior approval application to include any of that, so that they can't comment on any of it, because in a prior approval they can't ask you for a parking requirement. They can, obviously, they have to consider safety, access, egress, transport and highways, and they can put conditions on that. And then the fourth one for office to resi that they added in a couple of years later after the government realised they'd forgotten was noise. So they don't want a long established nightclub that's been there and been allowed to be there suddenly having residential flats next to it where everyone's going to complain about everybody else, and likewise. So if you're I looked at a site that had an MOT test centre next to it, so those loud pneumatic drills to do the wheel nuts would be going off all the time. You just got to be mindful of that. So prior approval, they can only ask what your mitigation against these things is. So if you can come up with a robust mitigation, even if there is a problem in one of these areas, they have to accept your mitigation. So, noise, there's all sorts of things you can do about sort of, mechanical, ventilation and triple glazing if you need to, and all sorts of different solutions if you have to go with them. So prior approval is just a really powerful tool.
Like you said, it just really streamlines everything, and like you said, that's great examples there and great bits of information going through those for us. Thanks very much for that, Rob. I'm gonna almost ask you to go through an example of a conversion that you've done from commercial to residential? Can you think of one other than? I know you've touched on a couple of examples already.
So I'll do a smaller example, and people who know me will know that I'm a fan of kind of not taking too many risks, of doing what you know, and it's important to learn and grow, and we never do anything special if we don't step out of our comfort zone, but do that in a purposeful and controlled way. So having done a bunch of blocks of flats at sort of 4 or 5 units per block, I then felt comfortable taking the extra step to go to an office to residential conversion that was only of a similar size. And in my case, I bought a very cheap building, which also made me feel comfortable because the numbers were just all within a space that I felt safe. So in a place called West End in Southampton, which is a sort of commuter village, if you like, just slightly outside of Southampton, I bought an office. It was part office and part retail building for £172,500. So very cheap. At around, I think, £85 or £90 a square foot of purchase price. I mean, unheard of right now. And that had a retail shop in the front. It had retail uppers above it. And then behind it, that was part of the old extensions that had been added on piecemeal over the years, was an office that was a security firm, like a local security firm's office. So I did a retail to residential prior approval on the shop and the uppers, and a separate office to residential prior approval. So I actually did 2 prior approval applications. And later on, also did a planning application for some external elevation changes.
So quite a lot of applications from that point of view.
I mean, it just shows my naivety, doesn't it? I did 3 applications. I was only getting 4 units out of this. But I mean, I look back on that now and think, how crazy was that? We only did the planning application. I mean, it's quite nice in some ways to mop up any changes that you need to make that you didn't know early on in an overall application. It's just an external elevations application, so it's relatively straightforward. But in actual fact, it was a mistake that we had to do that at all, because retail to residential allows you to make reasonable changes to the outside. So they get that you might have like a great big plate glass window in a shop, and that if you're converting it to residential, that someone in there might not like that. It's a bit too much window, and so that you might want to make some changes. So actually they allow you to make those changes as part of the prior approval. And I think I just got lost. I already had 2 prior approvals to go through, and I had all the right advisors around. I think it just got lost in the noise. So we could have escaped that planning application. As it was actually really helpful, because there were a bunch of other changes that we slipped in there, and it made sure we were totally squeaky clean and everything. So coming back to the example, so that was it was 1,950 square feet, and I did something I've not done since. At the back there was a single skin lean-to portion of the building. Now basically calling it a building, calling it a lean-to is overselling it massively. It was really little more than a shed that was built with blockwork rather than with wood. And actually in that rear portion, they had an acro. There was an acro put up right in the middle of the office, that was propping up a beam. And as I was walking around when I first saw it, the sort of 5 or 6 employees sitting there looking miserable and cold because it was damp, sat there, and I just casually asked one of them, like quizzically looked at the acro and asked them how long it's been there. And when the agent had gone round the corner and couldn't hear, he just quietly whispered to me, 7 years. Wow. They had propped it up 7 years ago, and nobody had bothered to do anything with it since then. I mean, there was a good portion of the back of that building that wasn't in very good condition. The front of the building and the retail portion, when it rained, the rain ran down the roof into a valley and then came inside the building. So if you stood on the second step up the stairs inside, it would be like walking through rain. There was like a wall of rain that you had to walk through to get up and down the stairs. So there was all these volunteers in the shop carrying bags full of stock up and down the stairs, and it would be, sodden, soaking wet. It was a crazy building. But that
sorry, Rob, carry on.
Yeah, so that I guess it was pretty brave, but yeah, that sort of goes some way to explain why it was quite cheap. And I did so many things wrong with this building. It's unbelievable, but ultimately it sold with a GDV of £710,000 after I'd sold the 4 units and the freehold. It made 22% profit on GDV. So
it's a great return
for a cash investment of £245,000, it made a profit of 155. So the return on the cash, what's that? Probably 65, 70 odd percent, something like that. And a decent return on GDV. And I got that so wrong that should have been a 28% return on GDV. It was my mistakes brought it down to 22. But I really learnt some lessons about having a margin of safety.
No, that's a brilliant example there, Rob, and it spurred a few questions for me. And one is, a bit unlike new build. When you do a new build, you don't know what's in the ground. But when you get out of the ground, you have a better idea of costs. With a conversion, arguably, hopefully you don't have to deal on the ground too much. But like you were saying, when you're walking around this building, you don't know what's in the walls. So the unknowns in the existing structure. What are some of the unknowns that you have come across when you're walking around these buildings, and how do you potentially mitigate against them?
Well, so I can think of 3 glaring ones in this building, 2 of which I've mentioned already. So actually, it took me a lot of visits before I realised that the rain came in to the building onto the stairs, and lots of extra visits kind of after we'd put our bid in and we were progressing and it looked like we were winning. Finding they needed to acro up one of the beams because one of the walls was crumbling I could have, it was very obvious that something was wrong, but it wasn't necessarily very obvious how wrong it was. The third thing I found in that particular building, when we took the ceiling off from that rear portion where they'd acroed up one of the beams, so it had a sort of ordinary flat ceiling, but a pitched roof, and in the roof void, they'd had sort of regular things happening with tiles moving or slipping or cracking, and so there was the odd opportunity for a leak. Instead of properly maintaining the roof and fixing those problems, they had draped polythene sheets sort of down each side so that they would catch any rain underneath the roof. So underneath the roof, the felt and the battens and the joists, they had draped these polythene sheets, really quite thick sheets as well, and then the water would gather there and then sort of drain down, and they tried to kind of lap them over one of the leaves of the wall. They hadn't even thought about whether it was the inner leaf or the outer leaf, and they just sort of draped it over the inner leaf sort of lazily. And those polythene sheets, of course, there was no breathability whatsoever. So condensation would gather on them. They would sweat essentially, and so they made the damp issues in the building way worse than you might normally have expected. Some of the rear portion was single skin of that building, so requires additional effort to turn it into a proper residential standard. And we always do new build warranties because we want to sell with Help to Buy, so the standards are even higher than building control. So there's lots of standards of insulation and all sorts of things. That building was crazy, but more generally speaking, structural issues I think are the thing mostly to watch out for. What's the roof like? What's the structure of the building? Does the structure of the roof look like it's okay? Are you going to have to replace the roof covering? If you're getting a new build warranty, you need to either replace the roof covering or demonstrate that it's got a long enough lifetime that it's going to outlast the 10 years of the new build warranty. And so you need some confidence that those things are going to go right, or that you factored in the cost. And when I look back at how bold I was and how naive about what I understood about some of those potential issues with those kind of things, and how expensive they can be to fix, it required a certain boldness that comes from being naive, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes, and like you said, that's why it's so important that you got the price you did with that. I know you factored in such a massive margin, but sometimes with not just conversions, any project, you can easily go over your build costs. It happens time and time again. You got a great return on that, but until you start knocking through walls, some vendors aren't just going to let you. Oh, do you mind if I pull this wall down and have a look behind it? It's just not going to happen. You've got to have to factor in some margin of safety there, aren't you? Really?
You've got to, I think, yeah. And I mean, ideally now it would be nice if we could do opening up works before we even bought the building. But the chances of you having a vendor who's allowing you to do that, we've managed to do that once now on one of the projects we've got going on at the moment. But I'm probably a bit more confident to insist on that when I think I need it. At the time, there's no way. I wouldn't even brave enough to ask, let alone knowing whether or not we needed to do it at the time. But you've just got to have the margin of safety in. I think it's really easy when you're excited and looking for one of your first projects. It's really easy to think, I don't need to worry about making a profit. I don't mind. I know how much of a learning opportunity this is. I just want the learning. And I'm always trying to tell the mentees that I teach, no, it's the other way around. Actually, you need more of a margin of safety because you don't know what you're looking at. So basically, your contingency needs to be bigger. And that only comes by having that margin of safety. So it's actually harder if you're a first-time developer to get into it because you don't know what you don't know. And so you've just got to sort of whack a great big lump of money aside for the things that you're going to find out later.
Yeah, absolutely. And some people think that, in an existing building, I've got 4 walls here, I've got electricity, I've got plumbing, all I've got to do is put a bathroom, put a kitchen in. But the amount of upgrade you potentially have to do from a commercial building to bring it to the new standard of residential is, the SAPs, the EPCs, the energy performance, you have to get those thermal values, all these energy values up to the latest standard of residential. There's so much more insulation and things that you'd have to put in than you would even consider. That's great. You've got the 4 walls there, but there's so much that you have to pad on there and put in place, isn't there? Really.
I mean, fire regs, acoustic regs, thermal. I mean, the acoustic test you get at the end. I always feel like I'm running the gauntlet a bit because, of course, you do all this work for months and months, which runs into years to get it right, to plan it, to spec it, to get the design correct, the construction, and then you've got this kind of holding your breath moment at the end when the sound engineer is doing all the sound tests. All of that is incredible. I've had quite a few conversations with people where, particularly, it seems people who've done a few HMOs where they've bought a house and they've converted the house to HMO and they probably put some en suite in and stuff. So they've done quite a lot of refurb to that house. But they might have done that at 40, 50, 60 pounds a square foot or something in that range, or down our way. And it's really hard to explain why that's not going to be the cost when you're converting an office building, even though it looks like it's a perfectly sensible office building. And they're like, well, this is all, especially if it's like reasonably new and it's from the 90s or the noughties or something quite recent, and it all looks okay, but actually there's still so much work to be done over and above just a light refurb type sort of thing. You'd go in and tart up a flat.
Absolutely, because it's not an existing residential building. It was a completely different user class for starters, and depending on the age is another thing. One thing that popped into my head there that I thought I'd share as well, I'm not sure if you do this, but I think it would be good for listeners, is on the sound tests. I don't know if you do this, but it's something we do. We will test a room out very early on. So if we're converting a building on our last conversion, we will try and finish one room a bit sooner than the others before we even start on the other flats. pay the extra to get the sound test in early and just take a bit of a breath. If it passes, then great. We get all the others exactly the same. It's not completely foolproof, but it can stop you and stop other people getting the whole way through a project and then being concerned about that air test or that sound test. Sorry,
that's a really good idea. I think I'll nab that one from you and take it forward.
Yeah, absolutely. We can talk
awesome.
about that some more. It's a good idea. It's definitely helped me in the past. That though, you know what it's like. Just before that sound test, you go down to site and you're sweating a bit because you don't want to have to redo anything or undo anything. So yeah,
and it's really expensive at that point. If you've gone way beyond the point where it's cheap to make any upgrades.
Exactly, and the few £100 for an extra test is just it's worth it.
One of the things we have done, and we started quite early after one of the first projects, was we bring in a specialist acoustic engineer right at the beginning, sort of via the architect. So the first project or two we did, they would sort of go out for advice on the acoustic requirements, but essentially they were doing it themselves. And it's actually not very expensive to have a proper acoustic engineer at the stage where you're doing the technical design work for the building, and it's a few hundred or like £1,000, sort of a low four-figure sum, and then they're speccing the acoustic requirements along with the thermal and fire requirements and everything, and then they can all be properly merged into one. So we very quickly added that in right at the early design stages.
That's really helpful. No, thanks for sharing that as well, Rob. I'm gonna move on a little bit and talk about post-COVID-19. It's affecting the way everyone does business, really, and I just wonder if it's going to change the way in which you are going to approach business in the future. Are you going to work more remotely where you can? A lot of people are looking into that. I don't know how much you do of that already. Is it also going to change the way in which you might look at projects? I don't know if you've got any thoughts on post-COVID.
So we always had the ability to work remotely. I have long held the aspiration to try and have Wednesdays off entirely. And I have half a day off on Wednesday, but I work the morning, so I tend to do that from home. And we're only a small team in-house. When the office is at its busiest, there's only 4 of us, and we all have laptops. So it's entirely possible to work from home. So for us, it was a very easy transition to not go into the office. And actually, I've just before COVID, I had moved us out of the office that I own because we were turning that into some flats, and I just started renting a serviced office short term. And as it hit, I've actually totally stopped that, and we're not planning to have a permanent office of any sort. So we've realised we need a tiny space for one desk and some filing cabinets. So we've actually taken that, but we don't need anything that's useful for all of us. And we're just going to meet up sort of 1 or 2 days a week in a shared space, where we can have some meetings and have a cup of coffee and some whiteboards and that sort of thing.
I think a lot of businesses are going to look at that. Like you said, small, adaptable businesses will address their office spaces, I'm sure. And will there be more of an opportunity for those shared office spaces that you rent as and when, or like you said, you just need a boardroom for an hour or two, some coffee, maybe even just a Starbucks or a Costa. That's it, isn't it, sometimes? And
I think the sorts of spaces that offer that flexibility, for us, they're really useful. And I'll happily pay a little bit more when I'm only taking the room for a day, because rather than having it for the whole month, where we're going to be out and about and working from home. And as we've got to the stage where we've got several projects going on at once, there's plenty site visits to be done, and reasons to be out and about anyway, where you're not sitting in the office. So that's one change that I was thinking about anyway, because we'd moved ourselves out of our offices, and actually we only took a 3-month lease on this serviced space. knowing that we might well stop it. And then when coronavirus hit, I was just straight away, right, we're binning that. Let's force the change on ourselves and see how we adapt. So we're going to go forward that way. In terms of how we work, what we're looking for projects wise moving forward, we've honed in on two strategies. One being the office to resi developments, and the other being buying blocks of flats, which we've always done and loved. I've always loved that, following my early experience with the one at auction. I think there are going to be a whole load of office to resi opportunities as companies large and small go through the same realization I've just gone through. I'm sure I think the head of Barclays, like the actual CEO of the entire Barclays Bank, said something like, yeah, we're never going to go back to everyone being in the office at once. We estimate we might need around 15% of the space in big offices that we needed before. I was just chatting to some of my friends the other day who work with traders in the city and in Canary Wharf, and for years and years it was always the mantra that they needed to be in one place in the city, and they've been forced to rethink that. I suspect it's unlikely that that's ever going to go back to be the same again. I mean, that there will be need for office space. So if big companies are thinking like that, right down to small companies where there's four of us and everyone in between, I don't think there's any reason why anyone in between would be any different. So I think there's going to be a whole swathe of new office buildings that don't really have a good use anymore, and certainly don't support the values that maybe the owners used to think that they did support, and won't command the same rents. And so, some of those will be ripe for conversion to residential, and some of them will be sort of prime city centre locations. So I was actually leaning the business slightly more towards the blocks of flats prior to this particular sort of first 6 months of this year, where we were ramping down on the conversions and up on the flats. But now I'm starting to think this is a real opportunity to do more office to resi conversions. The pricing of them had started to become untenable, I think. So many people knew about prior approval, everybody was chasing them, and the only reason that strategy worked was because you buy offices at one price per square foot, and the price you can sell the residential per square foot, the difference is more than the cost of the change. Well, as it was getting more and more popular, you're pushing the price of the offices up, and the margin just wasn't there in the same way. Well, now that equation's changed totally. So I think there will be slowly, it won't instantly happen, as leases come to an end on these offices and these larger office spaces in particular, companies decide they're not going to renew or go forward with one big communal space, that they'll then downsize or just move away, and those buildings will become available at a far more reasonable price, and so there's an opportunity to potentially convert back to resi again. It could well be growing now.
And I think that makes sense that would potentially be the case. When a large office building isn't getting taken up by someone else, and then you've got the empty property rates as well starting to kick in, all those start creating a big dilemma and decision for the owner. Do I hold out to find someone else to rent this? Do I try and sell it at this price? I think the decision will be made for them, won't it? Really?
I mean, it becomes a real squeeze, doesn't it? When you're paying all those extra costs on a building that you're not getting any usage of. I mean, I know when we buy buildings, when they're vacant, before we're getting to the point where we can get teams in to do work, the business rates alone are so expensive, they're really punitive, that actually we've started doing a process where we do a soft strip out very, very quickly, very early on. Day one we own the building, we'll be in doing a soft strip, even day one from exchange if we're allowed, so that we can get it into a position where we're not paying business rates on it anymore, just because the expense is so big.
Yeah, absolutely. get to an uninhabitable state and start work and get moving as quickly as possible if you can.
Yeah, it used to be that you could get away with it just not being occupied and it was kind of okay. Nowadays, you've got to go so far that it's not economic to turn it back into an office. But as long as you do that, then it's fine. And if you've stripped out, running hot and cold water and air conditioning and and heating and floor tiles and things, but toilet facilities, you don't have to do a lot of strip out. You're not doing a full strip out, but it's well worth doing to save the business rates.
Yeah, you're not going to rent it out like that unless you call it contemporary, and you just have it like that.
Industrial chic or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Rob, I've just got a few more questions now, and be mindful of your time. And you've given us so many lessons actually that I was going to ask that, but I think you've given us plenty of those. But in terms of certain habits and behaviours that you feel have helped contribute towards your success, all the success that you see in other developers and investors, what are some of the behaviours and habits that you see time and time again?
So it was some that I particularly admire and try and copy myself are really around kind of having humility, not being too bold. I know lots of my examples I'm a bit shocked at myself in retrospect of how bold they were, but I was taking bold steps in a safe way on small buildings or buildings that weren't very valuable. I see lots of people going for buildings that are frankly just too big for them, and I admire people. This property is a crazy expensive business to be in, and it can go very right, but it can also go very wrong. And baby steps is the way to do it. Being cautious. I try very hard now, and tell all the people I mentor, make sure that 80 to 90% of any new project you're doing is exactly in your wheelhouse. Is exactly what you do. It's kind of, it's right down the fairway type thing. It's exactly what you know and love and are good at and can draw on all your skills and experience and strength. That way you can test out and experiment and do something new with the 10 or 20%. And that's really important for us to learn and grow and find new things to do and new ways to make money and adapt in the market. But make sure it's only 10 or 20% that you're experimenting with. And because you're going to pay money for those lessons. And you need to be able to draw on the 80 to 90% where you know how much things are going to cost, you know how long they're going to take, and you know what profit margin you've got, so that you can draw on that portion to carry you through the overall project. And then the small portion is where you learn, and then once you've done that a few times, you know whether or not that's something you can bring in to your kind of stable of skills, if you like. So I think that's really important, and something that I try very hard to practice as well as preach. And I'm still, we're all learning all the time, and there's so much to learn. And I particularly wanted to learn about listed buildings, which I did. I've started on. I've done one listed building, and I've done enough to know that I'd like to do more. But I did a building that was mostly already a block of flats, so something that I knew and understood well. It was pretty much fully tenanted already, so it had an income stream, so lenders loved it. So there were lots of things that filled up my 80 to 90%, and then the fact that it was listed, which meant it didn't benefit from prior approval, which meant there's a listed building officer to worry about, which means and it's full planning, and you've got to do all those other things in terms of craftsmen and materials, all those things that are new and expensive and you're learning with. But that was an opportunity to start to learn about that, and I keep doing that. I try to have at least one or two new areas to explore each year, that written into my goals for the year, but I'll only do them when they're that small portion of a project. I'm not going to go and buy a listed building that's 5,000 square foot of empty office when I don't really know how to go about getting planning permission for that, and then have no idea how to do the works on it, because it's lath and plaster and all sorts of other craziness.
That's such a great lesson there, by the way, that 80-90%, because what you said previously about you'd done 4 or 5 flats, but as a refurb, but to do prior approval, you thought, okay, stick to the same amount of units and try that strategy. same with the listed building. And like you said, if you're not tweaking your strategy, then okay, everything's the same. Maybe go for one or two more units. That could be your 10% potentially. But if you are changing things, you don't want to change everything at the end of the day. I think that's a great that's a great lesson there.
In 2018, my two new things to try were, one, a listed building, which that was when I bought my office building that we just recently moved out of. That was listed, and it's a beautiful building from 1845. It's listed in archives on the Polygon in Southampton. One was to do a listed building, and the other was to experiment with new build. And I've never done any new build, and I want to try. And so for me, experimenting new build meant not buying a site that's already got permission for two houses or something, but finding an office building where there was some land or a car park or a big garden or something where I could make the project work based on my prior approval office to Resi that I'm very comfortable with, and we know the numbers on, and we can understand where the profit lies, and then sort of essentially get the land for free so that our experiment with full planning permission with new build in the car park out the back, we could experiment with that. And just by so I set my stall out in 2018, and I found the office building which was for the listed building goal, and I bought a house called I bought a site called Southern House, which is 80 Shirley Road in Southampton, which is a 6,000 square foot office building, and it has loads of car parking out the back, and actually a whole secondary building as well. And so that is our opportunity to look at new build, and we're just in the process of putting in a planning application, a full planning. We've done the pre-app advice. We're very comfortable with where we are. We're just going through all the consultations now, and then we'll submit a full planning application. And that's a real eye opener for me. I'm learning loads from a very, very experienced team around me, and we may sell it on for planning gain, because essentially that land is free for us. So there's a really good planning gain profit to be made. Or we might actually fulfill my goal and go through and having got planning permission on it, we could put a contractor in and build them out, and either sell on the open market or sell to a housing association or something. But I'm quite excited about learning that new skill, but very keen to do it in a low risk way.
That's so important, and what you touched on there, the fact that you've mitigated the risk by, if you get the land for free and you get the planning on it, and if you've got that guaranteed exit of, let's say, selling to council, for example, housing association, that's the word I'm looking for, housing association, it's happening to me too now, then you've almost mitigated that risk again, haven't you, really? You can take that next step potentially if you've got that guaranteed exit. So you've got layers of exits that you've potentially factored in there.
Yeah, we've got the jumping off point. So first off, even before that what I've described as that car park, actually the secondary building is a detached 3-bedroom house that's been extended, that we could do a sort of 10 or 15 grand refurb on it and sell it for more money than we ever need to risk around the land, because the land's all free and that's all upside. So that's a very sort of, we would in no way be maximising the potential of the site, but if ever we needed to, that's a nice fallback. Then we could sell on with planning permission for a nice planning gain profit as the sort of next layer, which is reasonably likely. Or we could go again to sort of fully maximise the value of the site directly, build it out and then sell either on the open market, which obviously is where we would absolutely maximise the price, or sort of one step down from that in terms of profit, but increased certainty would be the council for their own stock, or to a housing association for their stock.
I think that's a great example. I really, really would love to hear how that project goes and how it unfolds, really. Maybe we can follow up on that one day.
Well, fingers crossed. We're the office to Resi conversion. Actually, we were due to launch the sale of those flats at the beginning of April. Coronavirus has put that back, but we're launching in a couple of weeks at the beginning of June. The first 4 of those 10 units are ready, and we're ready to submit the planning application for the new build at the back as well.
So the hope is to sell all units on site when you're finished. Is that primarily what you look to do with most of your projects, is to sell the units once you've finished?
When we're doing the commercial to residential conversions, we're doing those to sell on the open market. We're getting new build warranties. So we, in terms of the quality, it's an existing building, but we're taking it to the sort of highest standards we can. I like to finish, in terms of the internal finish, we like to do high quality for the local market, but we're sort of pitching as high as we can where it's relevant for the local market. And they have the most value for sale rather than for rent. And then we use the funds from there to purchase blocks of flats that we hold longer term. So it's sort of like a 2-stage process to ultimately get to some income that's a little bit more passive.
That makes sense. It makes sense. Rob, I'm going to move on completely now, and I know you're an avid reader. I know you love Audible. You're constantly listening to books, be that property related, business related, or personal development. You touched on Rich Dad Poor Dad earlier, which is a great book. Do you have any books that have really changed your life, really, when it comes to business and property, and you can think of? So
I insist on all my mentees reading Rich Dad Poor Dad, and they have to report back and kind of give me a summary. So they have to have read it. That was life-changing for me years and years ago. And I've got my kids interested in playing the cash flow game. My eldest is 11, so I think he's the right age. So we're just sort of starting that now, and we play Monopoly and we play Payday, which is a new thing that I didn't know as a kid. But the book that once you've gone through a bunch of those sort of starter books, or the sort of the brilliant concept books like Rich Dad Poor Dad, and I particularly like the second one, Cash Flow Quadrant, which I think really drives it home. But beyond those, my favourite property book of all time, and it's actually even better on Audible, is by a US based developer called Sam Zell, and the book is called Am I Being Too Subtle? And it is absolutely phenomenal. And the brilliant thing about the Audible version is he narrates it himself in this really sort of raspy Jewish New York accent, which is incredible. He is, in my view, the most successful developer in the world ever. He is the reason why there is a thing called a REIT, a real estate investment trust, which is a sort of share thing that you can buy on a stock market that allows you to buy a share but invest in property and real estate. Sam Zell has become so good that he invented a whole new class of share investing, and he's branched out from property into owning businesses in all sorts of industries, like rolling stock on railways, and I think he's into steel and all sorts of things. I mean, truly phenomenal. So that's my favourite property book, property and business, really.
I have to say, by the way, that first Rich Dad Poor Dad, definitely a big changer for me. And I actually listened to the audiobook of Sam Zell probably about 8 or 9 months ago, and it's because you recommended it that I wrote it down, and I said, right, Rob's recommended this book, I'm going to try it out. And I completely agree. I think it's a fantastic book, and I've listened to other interviews with him, and I think he's a great character as well. So for people listening, definitely check out that book. What's it called again?
So his name is Sam Zell, Zell, and the book is called Am I Being Too Subtle? It's absolutely brilliant.
We're plugging Sam Zell there. We're doing more for him than we do for ourselves. Look at that. Rob, this has been great. Thank you very much for having this sit down with me today. I know we've given away plenty of great nuggets of information for people. Rob, if people want to get hold of you, find out more about you, where can they find you?
So the name of my company is King Property. My surname's King, so it's pretty straightforward. The website King Property, or on Facebook or on Instagram. I run a meetup that at the moment is virtual called the Property Meetup. in a past life in a different guise. We briefly ran the largest meeting in the country. It just happened to work that we got a reasonably good audience that month, bigger than anybody else. So I've just launched this new version of that meeting, the Property Meetup, a few months ago, and already we're getting sort of 80-90 people each time. Mostly those are on Tuesday nights, all free to attend, of course. So between those two things and those platforms, if you want to find me, it's pretty easy, I think.
Perfect. No, Rob, thanks very much for that. That's been brilliant.
Thank you very much, Raj. Loved it.